So first, I just want to kind of lay out a few, I think, historical dynamics that have really been central to I think that are central to understanding Israel's ongoing colonization of the Palestinian people. Um, and one of those is that, Israel is a colonial settler state, but not just that, it's a colonial settler state of a specific type. That is, it's a pure settler colony. Um, so unlike other forms of settler colonialism that we've seen in the past, which seek to exploit the indigenous population, the pure settler colony aims to control the land and it seeks to eliminate or forcibly remove the indigenous population and replace it with members of the settler population, i.e., it doesn't just bring its armies and its ruling institutions to a piece of land, but it also brings its own working class with it to replace the working class of the existing indigenous society. Um, and the kind of term that's used to talk about this is that pure settler colonies have a logic of elimination, and I'm quoting directly from from Daphna's article here that I had shared, which is she says that elimination can be achieved through expulsion, death, or assimilation. And where elimination is not possible, separation is the next viable option, right? And I think that's a really powerful and clarifying way of understanding what Israel has aimed to do and has done over the last 75 years to the Palestinians, where when it has been able to, it's carried out expulsions, murdered Palestinians, or tried to force their assimilation in terms of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Um, and where that elimination is impossible, they've tried to force that separation in the form of pushing more and more Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves and pretending or attempting to make the world feel like they do not exist. And I think, understanding that underlying dynamic of a pure colonial settler state is really important. One, because Israel, has always used the regional and international crises and realignments to deepen its control of the land and carry out mass scale expulsions of death of the Palestinian people when it's able to. So we think back about the original Nakba, right? After this happened after World War II and in a period in which British imperialism was on the retreat. And it took advantage of that opportunity to be able to expel over 700,000 Palestinians and expand its control of the areas in which it controlled. Same thing for 1967 during the Six-Day War, in which 300,000 additional Palestinians were expelled and Israel expanded and occupied the West Bank and Gaza. Again, smaller examples like the political disarray in the US when Trump was elected to be able to switch its capital to Jerusalem and get that recognized as such, to what we're seeing today in Gaza, in which it's using, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, Hamas's attacks and really the regional international situation to be able to try to destroy as much of Gaza and make it uninhabitable as possible, shrink it, and weaken the Palestinian movement. Um, and so that's kind of important for just understanding the dynamic of what Israel's trying to do in the present day of using crises like these to push forward its ethnic cleansing program. The other thing is that this logic of elimination and the political economy, right, this colonial settler state and the political economy that grows around it, tie the Israeli working class to their ruling class in this kind of colonial endeavor. So I think that's important just for understanding that it's right now the Israeli working class. And I don't mean this individuals. I think there's very brave and important Israeli leftists who are raising their voices, and we want to ally with them. But in terms of a social force, the Israeli working class is lockstep in support of the Zionist project. Even if they are not happy with Netanyahu, 80% of people support the current attack on Gaza and have historically supported the ongoing colonization of the Palestinians. Um, The other aspect is that its colonial nature from the beginning made it a really attractive asset for imperial powers trying to dominate the region. And in a way, Israel could never have established itself without that external support. And it couldn't continue its ethnic cleansing without that continued external support from the largest powers in the world today, the U.S. imperialism and the US state. And that's probably clearer than ever. It's the United States government that is vetoing resolutions for a ceasefire. It's the United States government that's sending its aircraft carriers into the region. It's the US government that is essentially going out there and putting on PR for the Israelis to try to provide cover as they give them time to be able to attack the Palestinians. And so Israel has been a very willing ally of US imperialism in the past, and it's provided something unique, I think, also in that most imperial powers were never able to find in the region, which is, for example, while the US allies with other regional regimes, authoritarian regimes, who are, kind of integrated into that imperialist order and work to protect it, they have always been susceptible to challenges and pressures from below by the Arab masses, which threaten those imperial interests, right? So if you think back to the Arab Spring or to the mass anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 60s, with Israel, Western imperialism has been able to find allies not only in the ruling group, but as we kind of talked, I was saying earlier, but the greater part of Israel's settler population, it supports that project. And so I think those are really, really deep connections that have been established historically, right, between the U.S. and Israel. Its support is related to the fact that the Middle East has been a central pillar of U.S. strategy of attempting to dominate markets and maintain its hegemony internationally. Dominance in the Middle East has been critical for that, and they've been able to they have over the years allied with Israel, and Israel's kind of the central and most important strategic asset there for some of those reasons that I just described, right? And that's, I think, important for us to understand kind of the depth of what we're seeing and the depravity to how far the U.S. government is willing to go right now. Part of it, of course, is some of the distortions of the pro-Israeli lobby, but there's a deeper element of the material connections between the military-industrial complex and between what the U.S. sees as its ability to maintain dominance in that region. And I think the other part, in terms of part of its understanding what we're up against to be able to break that support for Israel, the other part is that it also just shows, I think, how critical our role is here. So the work that we're doing is obviously central. This is not just an Israeli attack on the Palestinians. This is part and parcel of an American attack on the Palestinians, of the people in Gaza, from the advisors they're sending to the political interference that they're running to the ships that they're sending to the Middle East. And I think we have to elevate that element more, in what we're doing. But if the U.S. support is anchored in that historic relationship and its strategy in the Middle East and this with Israel, there's also a contradiction in that relationship, right? So the U.S. in a way kind of created a contradiction in the main pillar of its own strategy in the Middle East. Which what I'm trying to say is that same colonial settler nature of Israel, which makes it very much willing to ally with the United States, act as a repressive force in the region, ally with the most authoritarian states like Saudi Arabia and so on, be a weapons dealer in the region and internationally, and kind of export its knowledge that it's gained at repressing Palestinians to the rest of the world's ruling classes. If that's one element that holds that relationship together, there's an other element related to the colonial settler nature that actually creates periodic outbursts of resistance in the region because its unwillingness to deal with Palestinians and its periodic attempts to expel them, murder them, which reverberate through the region and globally, right? So in the region, as we've seen, there's mass protests that emerge in every neighboring country, and the plight of the Palestinians is seen as one of the most potent symbols of the authoritarian and pro-imperialist order in the region. It kind of becomes a stand-in for the lack of dignity, the economic situation in the region, and really opens up space actually for a lot of people to go out into the streets and protest in a way that they would otherwise be repressed in a massive way if they were protesting directly against their governments. And this and the fact that the U.S. relies on a colonial settler state as its central pillar, also in addition to being a lightning rod in the region, becomes a lightning rod globally for the United States. Right? It becomes a symbol, U.S. support, and what it allows the Israelis to do of the hypocrisy of U.S. policy, right? I think there's been a few articles written about the supposed, how much this exposes the U.S. commitment to a rules-based order, right? As it provides weapons and political support for a state that's carrying out mass massacres and ethnic cleansing. And at the same time, it also, therefore, resonates with millions of people across the world who have come out, and we've seen that resistance in Europe, here in the United States, and why they've had to try to ramp that down with 9/11 style kind of backlash tactics against us. Another element of this contradiction that kind of helps us understand the current situation is that it creates, the fact that the main the U.S. The main pillar of U.S. Strategy in the region is based on Israel, also creates massive tensions with the U.S.'s allies, who otherwise are typically involved, right, in the day-to-day repression of the Palestinians, the Jordanian state, the Egyptian state, who is part and parcel of the blockade of Gaza, are happy when things are quiet to be able to continue to profit handsomely in terms of their ruling elite and their states, and do business with Israel, along with the Saudis and United Arab Emirates and the Gulf states, who have either direct relationships or secret back deal relationships with the Israelis. They're all but when situations like this emerge, these periodic explosions, whether due to Palestinian resistance or whether due to Israel's massive attempts to expel the Palestinians, it creates huge tension. So we see the Jordanians, I think 9 Arab states just put out statements against Israel, and there's demands for the U.S. to end it, to stop its support. And the other element is it opens up space for U.S. imperialism's adversaries in the region to utilize this, I think opportunistically often, from Iran to Syria, to China and Russia. And so I think one of the ways to try to understand what the U.S. government is trying to do is to try to balance those, is balancing these two, this contradiction between its reliance on Israel for and what that means for its ability to maintain a pro-American order in the region. So I'll kind of spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about the current dynamics. Now that I've kind of laid some of that out, and I hope I'm doing this clearly. My apologies if not. The Hamas attack, I think I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, the logic there, and what Hamas could have been thinking in terms of strategy. And here I want to be clear. This is not a moral. This isn't an attempt to give an endorsement of what Hamas did, but an attempt to, unlike the media, which simply wants to paint Palestinians and Hamas just simply as monsters, something unique to their Arab barbarism that would their thirst for blood. There is some level of strategic rationale there that we at least have to understand, that kind of comes out of this decades long situation. And one of the situations is obviously the Palestinians have faced in Gaza 16 years of an ongoing siege. right? They've also, faced accelerated settler expansion and violence, especially in the past several years, an almost complete Judaization of Jerusalem. And at the same time, while the 75-year ethnic cleansing, the expansion of the settlements continues, Palestinians are evicted off more land, Gaza continues to be a prison. The Palestinian citizens of Israel lose even more rights and are threatened periodically with their own expulsion or being stripped of citizens. This is all happening. Meanwhile, Israel, the United States, the international community has basically just said, well, we don't need to deal with the Palestinians. We can ignore them. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just try to create, normalize the relationships between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the different Gulf states, and do that without even really talking about the Palestinians. We'll work to reorganize the regional order on that basis, and there's been some serious success in them being able to do that. So the plight of the Palestinians was completely and conveniently forgotten. And this is kind of the situation, along with the fact that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has become kind of a little bit more, not much more than a manager of Israel's apartheid policies in that region, in which its main task is to basically go out there and beat up Palestinians every once in a while when they try to resist Israel's expansion and policy. And so, I think if there's any logic there, the Hamas attack brought the question of Palestine front and center. That Palestinians can't simply be ignored, that the Palestinian issue is not done, that you can't just have regional accords like the Abraham Accord without Palestinians being involved. It's also an attempt, I think, by Hamas to put itself at the forefront of Palestinian resistance, especially as a more grassroots resistance has emerged in the West Bank in the past 7 years. And whether they expected it to go as far as it did is not completely clear. But what we do know is the Israeli response is, I think some of the outlines of that is this is the largest and most successful attack inside an Israeli border since 1973. And I think the amount of Israelis that were killed is even larger than that period. I'm not sure, but it's a huge attack. It basically, I think, has put Israel's in a position in which it wants to return its capacity for deterrence and wants to destroy Hamas. In addition to that need for a colonial settler state to be able to reestablish its deterrence and put its foot back on the colonized, who it worries might, further where you can start having protests spread to the West Bank, into among the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or that there's encouragement by this attack for other regional players like Hezbollah and so on. It wants to basically smash Hamas. And in the process, of course, as we talked about, is willing and will take that opportunity in the quote unquote fog of war to take the ability to destroy as much as Gaza as possible, kill as many Palestinians. I think part of their goal is to try to make Gaza much smaller and uninhabitable as possible. Now that they wanted to push Palestinian and Gaza out to the Sinai, Egypt said absolutely not. And so I think they want to destroy the body politic and the social fabric of Gaza, so that it's not able to be a place that can resist Israel's colonization. And this is, I think, reinforced in multiple ways. Netanyahu, I think, has some real political incentives to take this as far as he can to stay in power and stay out of jail, right? So far as the war in Gaza continues, I think there'll be some level of unity among the Israeli population in that sense. And I think that has to be taken seriously. They've been very open, obviously, about their genocidal policies, what their aims are, and how far they're willing to take this. On the other hand, and I'll try to wrap up here with this point, the U.S. response is also really concerning. For a little bit of a backdrop, the region for the U.S. is really has been in flux after the U.S. debacle in Iraq, after the Arab uprisings, and after the U.S.'s attempt to pivot to Asia to essentially try to warmonger against its perceived threat of China. Um, it's trying to reorganize its power in the region in a way where it doesn't have to rely on direct boots on the ground. It learned its lesson from Iraq in that way, but using the Abraham Accords and relying more on its allies and trying to knit them together to reestablish that order. So again, the Abraham Accords, the economic, the diplomatic, and political elements of that are a central part of U.S. strategy. And it's also doing this in a situation in which China and Russia's weight in the region has increased. China's economic weight is massive. It's now the largest trading partner to almost every Arab state in the Middle East, I think with the exception of Turkey and Israel. And it's actually beginning to play a larger political role in the region. If people remember, in April, it actually helped to reestablish diplomatic relationships between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Right, it was doing peacemaking, which the U.S. Surprised the U.S. and the U.S. of course didn't like that. Russia, on the other hand, was able to secure Syria's re-entry into the Arab League, and obviously we understand kind of some of the global contours of that competition with the border of Ukraine. So this kind of falls into deep. This is happening within the context for the United States of its international competition with China. It doesn't want to lose control of the region, obviously. And therefore, there's a really serious overlap with Israel's interests. And that is, the US is very much on board with Israel obliterating Hamas. And it backs that goal. It might not be fully thrilled about the fact that Israel is going to carry out a massacre of the Palestinians, but it's going to turn a blind eye to that because I think it understands that to allow Israel to be able to stand behind its largest strategic asset and not lose kind of its position in the region, it's going to have to allow Israel to take its pound of flesh. And and at the same time, while it does that, it's trying to contain that fallout, right, and pull Israel back from its most egregious actions that might otherwise agitate the situation to a point in which the U.S. might lose control and its relationships with its Arab allies might unravel. So it's managing the liabilities in the Middle East for Israel. So this attempt to essentially, provide the Gazans food and water and fuel, even as it allows the continued obliteration of the people in Gaza. And it's also having to deal and manage with some of the vulnerabilities that this is creating for the Biden administration back home. So I'll just end with, I think, because of what I described in terms of how committed I think Israel is to this process, to carrying out this massacre in the Gaza Strip, and to the fact that the U.S. is going to back it as much as it can here. It's an incredibly dangerous situation, obviously, for the Palestinians, especially in Gaza. And I don't mean that in the most obvious way of people being murdered, which we're seeing on the street, but I think in the sense that we may see a irreversible blow to the Palestinian body in Gaza, one of the places in which Palestinian society is actually still was the most coherent. Even though it was in an open air prison, it wasn't isolated and dismantled in the way that you would see in the West Bank. And I think that's part of the gamble, right? I think people who kind of have cheered this as a strategic victory. I think, in a blow to Israel, I think this was a gamble that is understandable in terms of years and years of dispossession, that a colonial power that has done this is going to create these kind of repeated explosions of violence, of horrific violence, but it really creates those conditions in which Israel can carry out another Nakba, and the United States seems pretty committed to supporting it, supporting and providing cover as much as it can. Now, there's obviously those contradictions that I talked about. It also can't let its relationships in the Middle East unravel. It can't allow its whole international reputation to be fully tarnished and put at risk its other interests globally, and we have to take advantage of that. And I think the demand for a ceasefire is incredibly important. I think it's going to be continue to be relevant, because I think we have at least another month of this at best, to continue happening, unless we could change the U.S. administration's calculations here at home. And I think we want to try to pull in as wide of a resistance as possible. I think the latest numbers I saw is 60-something% of Americans want a ceasefire, and prefer that. I think we have to figure out a way to bring in, people who may not understand the full history and contours, but have a knee jerk like this is bad. The US should not be supporting this, and pull people into that struggle in a variety of ways. And I think the protests are really, really incredible, but I think the ability for us to try to widen that into the labor movement, I think people are really well positioned to be able to do that, is really important, especially for people talk about BDS a lot, but I think the ability to get to the most important letter in the BDS, which is sanctions, really depends on how successful we are in being able to continue to build a left-wing congressional and political movement in this country at the local and national level. And as well as how much we can bring this issue into our labor unions and actually connect it to domestic policies. The fact that they're willing to fund wars and apartheid to the tunes of billions, but not support healthcare and so on. And then I think there's some long-term things that I won't get into because I'm out of time, that are interesting and interested in discuss that are interesting. Like, what does Palestinian liberation look like? I think we need a recomposition of the Palestinian national movement. These are things that are out of our control, but I think there's some interesting conversation there to be had about what strategies work. I do think ultimately, the only way we're going to be able to see Palestinian liberation is through mass resistance in the West Bank, and is in among the Palestinian citizens of Israel in the West Bank, and Gaza, combined with resistance in the Middle East and an international movement. And I think the Palestinian national movement will hopefully be able to recohere a leadership that could provide that vision. Until then, there's going to be an impasse. But in the meantime, hopefully we can stop the massacre and remove one of the most violent offenders against the Palestinians, which is the United States, from being in the playing field of what they're up against.